Hi, welcome back to InnoFX Live. Today we're sitting with Aaron Weinstein, our last session for today, and we're going to be talking about computer system validation for the rest of us. I don't know about everybody else, but I find it particularly mind-numbing, and in fact, one of the areas that continually gets me into trouble. Having said all of that, so what does for the rest of us mean, Aaron?
Well, you know, when it was first started out and companies were putting it together, it was driven by, and still is a large part driven by, some of the larger companies. And what happens is that they've created systems for computer system validation that are very complex and in many ways very onerous to anybody who's trying to use them. But that's okay within those groups because of the way they're set up and the way they work. However, more and more, we're seeing the FDA and other regulatory agencies are spending more time with companies, all companies, trying to talk about, talk to them about regulatory issues around their data. How secure is your data? How safe is it from internal issues and external issues? So it's really becoming more and more of an issue across the board. People can't ignore it. But when they start to think about computer system validation, their biggest concern is if they've heard about it from a different company or the way another company works, they end up saying, how are we going to implement something like that? How do we put something in place that isn't crazy? Or if we do, how could we afford this kind of thing? So, you know, when it comes right down to it, you've got to look at computer system validation, and a lot of the companies are. I would say the mid to small companies are looking at computer system validation in a different way than the other ones. They're trying to do it. And what they're trying to do is adhere to certain universal aspects of computer system validation, but at the same time not necessarily go crazy and go over the top. And so that's where we're at.
So are these primarily homegrown systems that these larger companies come up with? Is that what we're talking about?
I mean, for computer system validation, yeah, they are. They're large. I mean, they were, and they've sort of propagated. So this company hired this person from that company. They put that new computer system validation in place. They really, and it tends to have just gone from one to another, where they're really, really sure and feel very, very comfortable that that system will meet the scrutiny of the regulatory agencies, and they're happy to not deviate. Now that is changing, even within larger pharma companies, but the small to mid-range companies, and an interesting part of it is that the small to mid-range companies, one of the first validation steps they have to take is with computer system validation, because in some cases, they may outsource manufacturing, they may outsource even R&D, but they will use a computer system to satisfy a regulatory requirement in some fashion, and that triggers the need for computer system validation.
Just for clarity, so that I get it, I mean, the computer systems we're talking about are not the communication systems, it's the data management systems.
It's truly the data management, but in some cases, it actually can be communication. So for example, when they're doing clinical trials and people are calling in, and some of it is data that is being gone through that system, those being able to press the right numbers, being able to do that has to be validated, and that has to come under a computer system validation effort.
So let me make sure if I got it. So this type of stuff, would this fall in the general category of electronic notebooks, or?
Electronic notebook, it runs the gamut. Computer system validation will run the gamut from electronic notebooks, clinical trial data, you know, at the very beginning of the process where people are just trying to put things together and do all the way to the end with manufacturing execution systems, electronic ERB systems, and throughout the life cycle of a drug and throughout the life cycle of a company, you're going to have to address computer system validation in some way.
Okay, so like these dashboard systems that larger companies put in where they manage everything from resource allocation to timelines, are these things validated then?
So the question becomes, that's great. So the question becomes, do I validate, do I not validate? Well, the first thing you need to know is, am I using this system to satisfy a regulatory requirement? That's number one. So if a dashboard system is put into place And in addition, data is being used from that to report, for example, annual product reviews or something else like that, then you have to look at how that data is used, how that data is maintained, and validate accordingly.
Okay, so if it doesn't support it or go into a filing, the odds are I don't have to play with it.
That's true. However, you have to, putting together the right computer system validation effort requires that you go in and you understand what is our intent for this system, how do we want it to be, how do we want it to be used, and then determine whether or not that usage has some sort of impact, whether it's regulatory filing, all the way down to control.
Okay, so if it has a business impact, I may elect to validate that.
You might.
Yeah.
You might, but in my view, the move would be if you've gone through a risk assessment and you realize it doesn't fall under validation, you can still do a lot of testing for that system, all that shows that it's robust and important, without necessarily putting it into the validation program, because the validation program doesn't just trigger validation. The validation program triggers change control and all the other things that that you may not want to expose within the validation. I'm sorry, you may not want to expose to a regulatory body if you've determined that it does not have a regulatory impact.
I see. I've seen firms where, for example, informational documents are put into things that are called manuals as opposed to SOPs, simply because we can update them and not get hammered if I happen to be working off the wrong version. So then I get your drift there.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, while we're on the topic then, what are some of the universal aspects of a computer system validation program?
So computer system validation has some basics. First of all, obviously there's the procedures that govern it. And then within those procedures, you're going to want to look at things like assessments, change control, how you're going to do after you finish validation, how you're going to maintain the system, and then design documentation, validation documentation, so the qualification, the installation piece, the validation, operational verification, performance, all the way through things like trace matrices, which are used to demonstrate that a user requirement that you defined made it all the way through the testing and demonstrated that the system works the way you want to. So those are aspects of computer system validation, and then on top of all that, you do have procedures that are needed to show that you have the right backup for the system, that you can back up the system, that you do, and that if it does fail, you're capable of bringing it back up. Those are other associated things that should be in place.
So, having said that, I mean, so let me see if I got it straight. So, test scripts.
Yep.
This is good. This just makes good sense to maintain your systems.
You're absolutely right. But in addition to that, from a validation standpoint, you're able to then demonstrate that the system works. Test scripts are a good, solid foundation, but you need to determine whether or not a system requires validation and thus needs to be maintained in a certain way, or if it doesn't. Even if it does not need to be maintained that way, you can still test it, and test it thoroughly, as you would do with any software, especially extensive software. And the test scripts may be similar and all that, but the upfront decision-making about whether or not we're considering this a system that requires validation versus not allows you to have the flexibility on the systems that have a much less of an impact from a regulatory standpoint.
All right, so what I'm hearing is if it doesn't collect data which would be used to support some sort of regulatory filing or action, I think I'm in a situation where it really comes down to a business case and a business decision.
Yep.
Okay, so while we're on that, so it sounds to me like that's some sort of risk assessment. So where does risk assessment fit into all of this?
So risk assessment is one of the keys to an efficient system. You want to try to create an efficient computer system validation effort. And one of the absolute necessities to that is a risk assessment. And risk can take all forms, and companies can get bogged down in applying every level of risk. In this case, you want to focus on the risk to, as usual, to patients and to the product quality and those items, and how the system that you're doing is it being used to satisfy a regulatory requirement? Are there risks associated with it? And which areas within that possible software system are of greater risk versus lesser risk. So establishing and understanding how you want to do this risk assessment is key, because after that, it becomes easier as you do it. You get better and better at it. But the first piece of establishing that how you're going to do risk assessment, that allows it to flow from just an idea from a software standpoint to, okay, this is how we're going to implement this, and these are the aspects we need.
So is risk assessment the method in which you're going to do this? I'm not following it.
So when you bring in a system, or you're thinking, and this is the key, when you're thinking about bringing in a system, you will sit down and determine, it's absolutely risk assessment, you sit down and determine what risks does this software, or possibly does this software, pose to the regulatory requirements, product quality, patient safety. Looking at that, and then within that, the sub-piece is how is the data used? How are we planning on doing that? Even though you're just starting out, meaning you have some user requirements and understanding, you may not have built the system, it may not be ready, but that risk assessment allows you to figure out how you're going to do that from there on in. You will make decisions. Ultimately, the decision that you want to make out of this risk assessment is, does the risks posed by the system go past where we are comfortable and we feel the need to validate this system, versus have we established that the system presents a minimal or or no risk to patient safety, product quality, and thus we're not going to put it into our validation program.
Well, let me just, so maybe to make sure I got it. So I asked you about, the dashboard system. So things like SAP,
Yep.
those things are normally validated?
They are, but the absolute answer is yes, if you've determined that you're using SAP. The thing about it is SAP is so large that in all probability you're going to find the places that it does pose that there is a high enough risk that you need to go ahead and validate that system. However, the other part of it is that SAP and other systems like that are very large, and the part of the next element after you've determined whether or not you're going to validate and needs it, the next element of assessment is being able to determine which parts do you need to, which ones are the higher risk and which ones are the lower risk. An example, although not always true, but an example is that there usually is a large financial aspect to SAP. And you can look at those modules, you can look at the way that's put together and say, you know what, we don't need to test it, or if we do, we're just going to do this, because that covers us for those, because those are low-risk operations.
Understood. So SCADA obviously is a high-risk deal.
SCADA across it will be a high risk, and typically because of the way they're going to be used. You're going to get data, you're going to make some decisions depending on what the SCADA system does. Even if it is just monitoring and not, some places will use it as strictly from a monitoring standpoint, very, very little control. But yes, a SCADA system, it's bringing in the data, you're going to use that data, but the key is to understand how you're going to. Now, if you're going to bring in an automation system and not use any of the data for anything, that's sort of counterintuitive. But you may use the SCADA and it may collect some data, and if you've determined certain pieces of data and certain control elements are not going to have an impact on product quality, then the testing for that should be minimal.
So, okay, I think I'm starting to get it. I'm
Okay.
a little dense, but
All right.
I'm starting to get it.
No.
So what are some of the other elements of an efficient CSV program?
So when we talk about efficiency, we're talking about, going back to what we first started discussing, efficiency is taking the universal elements and making sure that you're hitting those and you're not necessarily creating a system that's impossible. So, for example, depending on how complex a system is and the risk level, that may be where you want more documents versus less. But in some cases, you may buy a system that represents a relatively low risk, and you choose to put a bunch of documents together. A good example would be user requirements, functional requirements, and design. You could put that into one document and cover that, because the system is not that complex. It does need to be validated, but it's not that complex. And that way you're not writing out 3 different documents, waiting for each one to be approved, and going through a process that can be tough. I mean, it's viewed, in the software world, they'll talk about the Waterfall Approach, which is just what we were talking about. You cascade down, you stop. User requirements, you get them approved, then you go down. But in reality, software companies are really going with more systems that are, software development that's more like agile, which is a much more, it's a better way for them to do it. But QA or quality assurance may hear that and say, no, we can't do things. We have to do the Waterfall Approach. You have to wait till we finish that. And what you need to do from the standpoint of creating an efficient system is you need to build it in saying, you know what's acceptable? We will accept that in some cases you can put all these documents together. I'll even go one more, back to risk assessments. You may have already determined through risk assessment that there are certain kinds of systems that will just never be validated. List them out. Put it out there. Don't go through a risk assessment documentation process when you already really know the answer that it's no. Start to list those out, put that in there, and let your system work that way. Give some of your people more power to make those decisions up front versus having to present it to an entire committee. Those are some of the aspects.
Who customarily owns this? What? Okay, so we're consultants. We go to the client. So who in the client organization owns this stuff?
It really depends, and it depends on the type of system. So, for example, in some cases, if you have a system with a lot of servers, a lot of routers, a lot of switching, that aspect of it, IT will actually take and own. They'll view that as theirs from an infrastructure standpoint, and they'll want to know what's going in there in this program. They want to sign off on that. Downstream of that, if it's, let's say, a manufacturing execution system or something along those lines, it may be the actual ops group, the operations group that says, you know what, I'm going to own that piece. That's mine. I'll deal with that. It's rarely quality assurance that owns them unless they're the ones that are doing the operation. So a document management system, for example, the owner may actually be QA, and they may actually own that software with the aforementioned IT folks handling that. So the IT people, as has come around in industry and everywhere else for years now, are taking more and more of an interest in what's going on in the validation aspect.
So a document management system like Teddy or Dragon or one of these things?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And so those types of systems where sometimes you're uploading PDFs and saying that they're approved, but more and more of them are really dealing with things like electronic signatures, people being able to, a workflow that allows people to sign and edit and do those things so that in the end you have an approved document.
So part of the validation is assuring the security as well?
Absolutely. So when you talk about electronic signatures and data, validating it, you have to demonstrate that, so for example, if somebody's going to put in their password along with their authorization, that says that they signed it, that they're the ones, they know, that they understand what they're doing from an electronic signature standpoint. And data has to be secure. Data that is entered cannot be, it cannot be undone without a true audit trail showing, hey, I corrected this, here's why, and all that, and being able to go through that. So yes, it's when we're talking about security, we're really talking about data and the ability to demonstrate that the data is safe and secure and unalterable.
I think we've gotten the background, what it is, the risk assessment, which ones we should leave alone, which one we should validate, security. So how do you implement something like this?
So one of the first things you really want to do is, if you're a company that's just, hey, we have to do validation, and it happens that it's like, oh, and we're on a timeline. So the first thing you want to do is you want to sit down and you want to do you actually want to do two things. First, you want to plan. You want to sit down and understand what do we want to accomplish. We know that in the short term we want to validate this software, but what does that really mean? Sit down, start your planning phase, understand understand the procedures you need to put in place, and understand the things that come out of that, including master plans and other things from a validation standpoint. In addition, the procedures I was talking about before, backup and recovery, operational procedures, things like that that allow the system. So understand it from that level, because some of those things you build are the things that are going to help you do CSV for a long time, so you're going to want to build it right. And the other pieces are just for that specific piece of software, because usually this is triggered because somebody realizes that we have to validate a certain piece of software.
Right, so usually what comes about is, gee whiz, I have to validate it, oh, and by the way, what problems am I going to be running into? So what's that? I mean, what are some of the typical breakdowns?
So some of the issues that can come around, first of all, it can be cultural. What I mean by that is that if a company doesn't understand validation, or if there's one person that does and all they understand is a very large and cumbersome system, when you attempt to implement something like that, it can be very challenging to face off against that culture. Equally as challenging is just the culture of not knowing about validation at all, and you have to start with the educational process around validation, go through that. I suggest meetings, I suggest some training, and things like that allow the company as a culture to start to understand, here's what we're trying to do, here's why, these are good reasons, and they're good sound reasons, and it's not just simply that we're trying to make it so that the regulatory bodies don't push us. You're also trying to demonstrate these things we bought, they're fit for use, they're good, they're under control. Because validation, one of the parts of validation that can be very good is you start to put something through its paces and you realize there are issues. Even on legacy systems that have been around for a while, you start to put it through its paces and people say, oh yeah, I've just been dealing with that issue for years. Well, it needs to be fixed, and it gets fixed, and that's one way that validation serves outside of just satisfying regulatory expectations.
So, I think one of the things that I'm hearing is, it's education, it's part of the implementation is bringing everybody into the same room so everybody's got the same idea. So, in general, I mean, when we go in to work with folks like this, what is the majority of the stuff that we work on then? Is it batch record execution, or what is it? What's the predominance?
The biggest piece is definitely around control systems for automation systems for equipment. That's a very large piece of it. And then the what I call more of the pure software pieces, like laboratory, some of the laboratory equipment where even though there's something happening, it's all this data that's coming in, the document management systems, the enterprise resource planning systems, the ERP systems like SAP. That's what I'm seeing. I mean, I know that I'm giving you a gamut, but that's really, at any one company, you could see all of that. And at the newer or the companies that are just getting into it, it is data. It is about clinical data and other things that they're just putting together, and they realize, you know what, we haven't done enough to demonstrate that we have it under control. And validation in the end is about establishing and documenting your control over a system. One
of the things I always find interesting is to get a sense of the temperature out there, and one of the things is, so how many people in our industry are into electronic batch signature?
More and more, actually. I mean, 10 years ago, it was hard to find anybody that would do that. But I couldn't give you a hard number because I don't have it, but I would tell you that more and more companies are becoming very comfortable with electronic signatures, and from a batch record standpoint, if they can implement it, many are doing it. Even if it's not a full piece, but it's just part of an overall batch or part of an overall process, they are finding ways to put it in so that they can use electronic signatures at that point.
The other thing I've noticed is that whenever you apply an electronic signature to a batch record, it becomes 300 pages as opposed to 30. But maybe that's just me.
Well, the thing is, it's supposed to become no pages, right? But yeah. And part of that is cultural. What you're talking about is people truly afraid that we're going to run into a funky place and I won't be able to defend it and all those other things.
So how many times have you reacted to an inspection of a deficiency? FDA puts them on notice.
Well, In the past year, at least 3. And one of them was intense. It wasn't the FDA, but it was the EU and regulatory bodies in Australia that basically said, hey, you don't have any computer system validation. You know, they were able to, you know, they called and they asked us, and we were able to work with them on it. And there was a lot of success because they didn't want to have to rely on a company. They wanted to create a system. So we actually sat with them, worked on it, and over the course of a year, we got them to where they wanted. We actually reduced the overall effort because they were able to demonstrate that some things didn't need to be validated that were originally pegged for it. And in the end, they had somebody trained and was able to go ahead and run with that. And now, you know, they'll call us with questions. But the thing about it is that's what you want to put in place. A system that can be run by one if you're that kind of company.
Well, I think let's, as we get down to the end here, let's see if we can wrap this up. So what would be the one-line elevator speech if you were going to tell a prospective client about computer validation? What's the deal?
Bottom line is this: computer validation is no different than any other validation. It is demonstrating fitness for use. The system that you do that, just because there are complex systems you're working with and you're validating, do not require complex systems for validation. They require that universal aspects be addressed and that you do it in such a way that the best way to do it is in a flexible fashion that allows you to make the right decisions for the right system.
Well, thanks a lot, Aaron, and that concludes our InEffects Live for a discussion of computer system validation. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.